Hello, viewers. Welcome to this episode of Insights by Social Friendly. Today, we're going to talk to Shreejit Borthakur about the future of agriculture. Shreejit is a development consultant with years of experience in fields such as impact investing, rural business development, and agriculture. He is currently associated with the Avishkar Group, and some of the organizations he has worked with in his consulting tenure include the World Bank Group, UNDP, USAID, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, and the Rockefeller Foundation. Hi, Shreejit. Welcome to this episode of Insights by Social Friendly. We're very excited that you could take time out to be with us and talk about the future of agriculture.
Hi, Prassenjit. Really good to be connected here. And thank you for inviting me to talk about agriculture. And the time is not an issue because this is something that I'm involved in and I'm passionate about. So it's really good to have a brainstorming kind of a discussion around the theme.
So, Shreejit, before we start discussing about the impact the COVID pandemic has had and the subsequent lockdowns, I mean, all of that has had on the agricultural sector, could you please give us some insight as to how the agricultural sector was doing before the pandemic so that, our viewers have a reference point as to understand better?
This is a very interesting question because I'll use India's example, and probably that can be seen as a proxy to South Asia and also for other developing economies. It's understood the agricultural sector is a necessity. It's an essential sector, and it's not like the entertainment industry or any other, let's say, non-essential sector. So basically, when you look at it in a way, it is a backbone of the economy because without this sector, you cannot actually progress. And this is somewhat reflecting in the growth figures of the sector also. For example, the Government of India data on the last quarter of the last financial year, which is January to March 2020, the Indian economy grew at about 3.1%. And this is because a lot of the other sectors contracted during this period, but it was the agricultural sector which was greater than the national average. It was growing at 5.9%. So it indicates that there was a lot of let's say there is a lot of potential of the agricultural sector to, let's say, mitigate some of the contractions in the other sector, because this sector will continue to operate and will need to operate before the pandemic, after the pandemic, and even during the pandemic. So yeah, that is how I see the agricultural sector throughout, before, now, and after.
Of course, that makes sense because, I mean, people have got to eat, right? So, I mean, the agricultural sector, like you rightly said, is indeed the backbone of a society. So moving on, I think what can you tell us what sort of confusion and uncertainties have been created by the pandemic, and where does the agricultural sector stand in light of the pandemic?
The distinguishing feature about this pandemic is that no one knows a lot about it. So it has been uncertain. So if you look at, again, India's example, when the first lockdown happened, the effort was to completely stop everything, even interstate travel or even, let's say, even local people going out. It was like an absolute curfew. Over the same time, although the intensity of the pandemic has not reduced, the lockdown restrictions have reduced. So right now, I can say that during the first lockdown, because of a complete curfew, there was a lot of impact on the agricultural sector. The critical impact, the most important thing being this shortage of labor, because interstate transportation was restricted. So I'll just put something for perspective here. When people talk about the agricultural sector, the first image that comes to your mind is that a farmer is working on the field and he's getting things done. But on a normal basis, or in a majority of cases, it is not the farmer who works on the field. He gets labor to work on the field. So that is something which people may not have. It's not always on the back of the minds of the people, but this labor scarcity caused by the pandemic was a big issue that was created, and this was very strong during the first phase of the lockdown. Now, over time, as the lockdown restrictions have been reduced, what is happening is that the labor scarcity problem has been addressed to some extent, but people will still need to get a hang of things about how it's happening. Because I'll give you one more example, is that when there's a peak season, you need a lot of labor, and a lot of this labor movement happens across districts and states. So even now, we are not very clear whether labor movement will be allowed within districts at a consistent basis so as to plan better. So that is how I see the supply chain being impacted during the phase of the pandemic when it came in, and the uncertainty it brought. Another thing is that although like goods vehicles were allowed to move for interstate, etc., but the problem was that the laws were not very clear. So I have myself seen a lot of examples in which, suppose I want to get a vehicle to come to a different state, having essentials only, but the government, but the officers at the checkpost were stopping the vehicles. So that uncertainty is still there to some extent. It has been like a little structured now. People know what to do. People know the approach to do it. But I cannot say that all that information has been trickled down to the grassroots at a level that the supply chains become as fluent as it was before the pandemic. So the supply chains are still impacted, and that is one place where I see that COVID has significantly impacted agriculture. Labor scarcity is what I am coming to.
That makes sense, because the next question that I was going to probe you on was, do you see the supply chain of, India's supply chain getting impacted because of this pandemic and because of the social distancing measures and the migration of laborers? So, so what you're saying is that is going to be an issue going forward, but then how can the government, the farmers, the agro companies mitigate that risk, the challenge?
So that's a very right point, because definitely the supply chain will get impacted to some angle because of the COVID thing. And apart from labor scarcity, what is happening is that people are also, like in Gujarat, someone was telling me that the places where vegetables are being grown, there have been a lot of COVID positive cases. So people are actually getting scared to buy vegetables from that place. So what is happening is that, although because of fear, because of reality, both coming together, the supply chains are getting impacted. And the thing is, again, we have to live with it. At some point, everyone has accepted that we have to live with it. So there are certain ways in which you can overcome these disruptions in the supply chain, and it involves, I would say, all stakeholders will have to come together and work towards it. So I can take you through some specific use cases or specific examples of how people can prevent the disruption of the supply chain and create resilience for even future events such as COVID. God forbid something happens like this again.
So, Shreejit, moving on, I think we would like to understand how, going forward, what the future of agriculture looks like. What are the challenges and what would be the solutions to those challenges? So I think we can address these things in two parts. So first, we maybe can talk about the challenges that are existing and that have to be addressed going forward.
So I'll basically talk about the challenges which were there even before COVID and how they have, let's say, amplified because of COVID. So let's look at agriculture in a developing economy in general. The first thing, a biggest challenge that is there, is that we have a lot of smallholder farmers. Now, there are 80% of these farmers in India, I think they are smallholder farmers. So they do not enjoy the economies of scale. And with time, the land is getting even more fragmented. So that is resulting in lower incomes per household, because the amount of land that they can cultivate in is become lower over the course of time. Secondly, like I mentioned, labor scarcity is a big issue. And I have seen this normally, that there are a lot of welfare schemes for laborers, like the Manrega scheme is there and all, but there have been some studies that suggest that people, because of these schemes, have moved away from agriculture into non-farm activities. In addition, because of increased migration over time, the shift has happened, which has resulted in further labor scarcity. Now, if you look at these 2 points, the thing about fragmented land holdings and about labor scarcity, both of these two things are leading to a rising cost of cultivation. So basically what has happened is that the cost of labor has increased so much, the cost of inputs have also increased as a normal effect of inflation, that the cost of cultivation in agriculture has gone up so much, but the prices that farmers are getting have not increased. So that, I would say, from a very, very broader development perspective, is that the biggest challenge is that the farmer, the smallholder farmer, before the pandemic was not getting as much as he could have earned through agriculture. After the pandemic, this has only increased. So I'll, like, for example, now the labor scarcity problem was there, but now we don't know how things will pan out. Every migrant laborers have gone back to their own states. Now, does that mean everyone is going to work in agriculture? If that means everyone is going to work in agriculture, the fragmented land holdings will even have more pressure now. Secondly, what is happening is that norms such as social distancing will have to be followed. So if I visualize a farm, I can definitely imagine labor in the farm working with keeping some distance between themselves. But after the day's work is over, when they go back to where they are staying, that is where social distancing will not be maintained. There are many reasons for this. Firstly is because most farmers will not invest in infrastructure for the labor. And because the thing is, they don't have so much of a, let's say, uh, a bottom line to actually take such kind of infrastructure investments. So when they come back, when the labor finishes his work on the field, he comes back to where he's staying, their social distancing cannot be followed. So this is something that might even scare the labor from going to work. So it's very difficult to say that whether because the migrant laborers have gone back to the towns, the problem of labor scarcity will be solved. But the thing is, either there will be a lot of disguised unemployment now because everyone's working on the same field, or the fear of people working together might still continue with the labor problem. So the problem of labor, whether scarcity or extra, will still continue in agriculture. Secondly, another thing that we have seen is that a big part of the challenge, like I mentioned, is the supply chain being disrupted because of transportation and let's say movement of vehicles. So what is happening as a result of this is that when you harvest versus when the material comes to the neighboring town, the time frame has increased. So this has become a very critical challenge, and this will continue to be a critical challenge because the uncertainty will linger on for some period of time. So like again, I'm saying that because the material will not reach in time, because there will be a force on the pressure on the factors of production, these challenges will continue in the agricultural sector because of COVID.
But what are the solutions? I mean, what are the ways that I mean all the stakeholders can implement to mitigate these risks and to come out of this swinging? Because this all seems very doom and gloom. So I mean, I hope you can highlight some of the solutions as well.
Now the thing is, all of these solutions have been thought about from before, but in practice there's still a lot of potential. So for some people these may sound as like very idealistic situations about things happening, but this has to happen eventually. So one of the solutions that I see is definitely to encourage near farm processing, near farm storage. So now what is happening is that farmers have to travel a lot of places for warehouses, and they also have to pay high prices. So there are a lot of private sector companies which have been working, like Ergos is there. They have been creating small scale warehouses which are either solar powered or energy powered, which can be kept near the farms. So basically that increases the shelf life of produce. That is a wonderful way, and that is something that will definitely become more relevant in the post-COVID area. Similarly, near farm processing. So if you look at solar dryers, so just by drying chilies, you can increase the shelf life by around 30 days. It's possible. So basically, near farm processing and near farm storage is something that will definitely come up. Another thing that is important, and this is something that we are also working on, is like again I keep mentioning, and this is like probably the 8th time I'm mentioning it in this call, it's that labor problem. So the thing is, earlier transportation between districts were easier, states were easier, so it was easy to manage demand and supply. But now because of the uncertainties, probably you'll need a pass to go from one district to another. Probably you'll need even higher permissions to go from one state to another. This will need a lot of planning. So suppose you need labor a month later, you'll have to probably start planning today. Earlier, you could just plan a week before and you could get it. So we definitely need a solution which aggregates labor demand and labor supply. So if suppose there is a particular place which is growing some crops which are labor intensive, we need tools that can aggregate or forecast the labor demand in different parts of the calendar year so that the labor supply can be planned accordingly. So this is something which we see as a very big or important solution which can create a lot of difference in the agricultural sector. Then thirdly, there's been a lot of talk and it's pretty impactful, the kind of things that are coming out of the use of agricultural technology. So basically you start incorporating technology into agriculture. Now when I'm talking about technology, I'm talking about two things here. One is the traditional technology, which includes harvesters, or which includes tractors, which also include solar dryers for processing, etc. Then secondly, there is something like the digital technologies, which is basically using ICT-enabled technologies for farming. Now, these ICT or even IoT-enabled technologies for farming. So, for example, there are something called farm management information systems, basically where you are using farmer-level data, you are collating data from a lot of different farms to provide advisory services to the farmers. So, what this is doing is that this helps the farmer increase his productivity and reduce the cost of cultivation. So now, and the thing is, this information sharing is happening virtually, so the farmers can get advice without actually having the required capacity building on the ground. Similarly, when I'm talking about agricultural technology and specifically digital technologies, we don't know how shops in the rural place will operate now. We don't know how inputs will be available, because the input supply chain will also be fragmented or disrupted because of interstate travel, etc. So aggregation of inputs for farmers, like there are a lot of platforms which allow, like AgroStar is there, it allows farmers to buy inputs online. And basically how you can optimize these platforms is that when you know that 100 farmers have placed an order from a particular geography, you can go and deliver the inputs to all of them together. So it basically creates a safety net for the farmers, and it also ensures that they get the inputs. Secondly, they get better prices because it's being ordered in bulk. And thirdly, the thing is, you can plan the input delivery better. Similarly, what is happening is that another solution is now from the input side to the output side. Once you're producing the crops, can a Ninja Cart, an enterprise which is working in market linkages, come and collect the crops based on data that you give to the company. So basically, let's say you have a farm management information system in which you have recorded that you are cultivating 3 hectares of land, and you are cultivating, let's say, 3 hectares of, let's say, mango. So when I have this data, using that tool, I can forecast that on this date, you'll have these many kgs of mango ready and ripe to be sold in the market. So now can I link this to a market linkage kind of an ICT company, which knows that there is a supply of, let's say, these many tons coming from this village? Can that guy pre-plan and pick it up? So aggregation based on digital technologies is going to be a very big thing. Now, to go into a more dystopian kind of a framework, let's say in terms of technologies, if social distancing is going to be strictly followed on the grounds, you might have to automate processes. IoT-based feeders for your like allied sectors, IoT-based irrigation systems, all of those things are available, but they are really expensive and only can be procured by the larger farmers. But that also is a typical solution area. So if you look at China, because China had this labor scarcity problem from long before, even before the COVID thing, because they have a very aging population and a lot of the people cannot work on the field. So what happens is that they had started leveraging drone technology for spraying pesticides and fertilizers. So now when you use drones, what happens is that firstly, the labor is not exposed to chemicals, that increases their longevity. Secondly, the amount of chemicals you use is also reduced. Normally when people go out and spray manually, you tend to spray a lot more because you always think more is better. But with a drone, you can actually plan out the spraying process, and then you can cut down on the cost of cultivation by reducing your chemicals use also. So drone technology is also something which is very idealistic and might be required if social distancing norms are completely kept into place and it has to be strictly followed. So I would like to add one more thing here is that this is a very, let's say, below the line kind of a trend which has happened in agriculture, but very few people are talking about it. Some of the people who are passionate about the sector definitely know about it. Is that participation of women in agriculture has increased tremendously. So around, I think the last census, it was around 32%. Today, around 48% of the farm labor in India are women. So now when
that's a very interesting thing you point out, yeah.
So this is also related to a pre-COVID kind of a situation. Men farmers were migrating out to cities. So what was happening? Women were going on the field. Now women farmers, the proportion of women farmers has significantly increased, but the societal norms, the cultural barriers, the access and control over resources and assets prevent their participation in agriculture and the potential that they can achieve. So I'll give you an example. When you're talking about agricultural technology, what happens is, let's say, farm management information systems. In such systems, when you input data, when you get advisory, they're often in a language which women might not be able to read, because culturally they have limited exposure to education in rural areas. So in such cases, what is happening? The technology is there, but the technology is not gender sensitive. So it is very biased to men. So you will see that there are tractors, men are driving tractors, but when it comes to paddy fields, women are physically using sickles which have been made so heavy that it actually reduces your efficiency. So basically, one of the key things that will have to change, or one of the biggest solutions that will come into play, is to make technology gender sensitive so that women also start adopting it. Currently, women do not go to markets because of, again, cultural reasons. They do not like market-facing roles. They send men to do it. But if you imagine that 50% of the workers, that half of your workers are going to be women in the field, so they need to have this power. They need to have this capacity. So I think that as we are restructuring things in the post-COVID things, we are planning to change our ways, go into better ways of production. Making or mainstreaming gender in agriculture is going to be one critical piece of the whole puzzle.
So yeah, I mean, all of this sounds very idealistic, but what you're trying to say is basically, first the farmers have to be brought front and center going forward. Technology has to be leveraged, and gender mainstreaming. I think these are the three key things that you say should be.
So this is coming directly from the COVID perspective, and also let's say it's also a panning across, like in a non-COVID situation also gender mainstreaming will play an important role even then. But let's say when we are talking about the future of agriculture, we are not only looking at COVID, we are looking at future as a whole. So there are other things also which I feel are very important for the future of agriculture. And one of the biggest things that we need to do as India is, or even other developing economies have to do, because they have a concentration of smallholder farmers, is to get into circular agriculture. So what is happening is that agriculture in India is creating so much of waste which is being burned. You see the pollution in Delhi where is primarily because of the burning of agricultural waste and residue. So now we have to understand how this waste can be either used into energy, converted into energy, it can be converted into fodder, or it can be now there are amazing organizations working in converting agricultural waste into textile. You would know that textile is probably the second most polluting industry in the world after fossil fuels. So basically, what you're seeing is that agriculture can feed that industry, reduce substantially the pollution and the impact, the negative impact of other industries as well, if you get into the circular mode. Now, when I'm on this point, I would like to take you to the recent locust attacks that are happening in India currently. So there are a lot of talk about why this is happening, because it's been happening every year, but the magnitude is really, really humongous this year. And it is going back to the thing of climate change. So because of climate change, favorable environment was created for the breeding of these locusts in Africa, and that has increased their numbers by a lot of things. So when I'm talking about circular economy or circular agriculture, it is going to impact things which are threatening it today. So if you practice circular economy, you can try to do things in totality over the next 30, 40 years, probably that will have a very, very good impact on a lot of other things which are creating a threat to mankind, or even like the universe beyond mankind today.
That's very interesting. But can you give us a successful use case that where there have been successful implementation of these practices and that's seen really good results?
Okay, thanks for this question, because it is very apt for me, because in my work we interact with a lot of enterprises who are trying to change the landscape of agriculture, and our understanding or our idea of transformation is that transformation should be sustainable. So there should be a business case as well as a social and environmental case. So there are a lot of enterprises who are doing amazing work. So in India, I can tell you that there's an enterprise called Cropin Technologies, which is like one of the biggest in agricultural technology. They've been winning a lot of awards, and rightly so, because they have revolutionized agriculture in a very, very dramatic way. For example, using crop level data and remote sensing technologies to provide insurance to farmers, like crop insurance, because crop insurance is another thing that is going to come up in the future. So when I'm talking about digital technologies, very good success story would be Cropin. Similarly, India is also home to a lot of digital innovations in the case of aquaculture, because now with increasing research, it is being seen that fish food is a very good source of protein, and there are companies like AquaConnect, Eruvaka Technologies. They're developing amazing IoT-based sensors and feeding systems for aquaculture, which is actually increasing productivity, reducing the cost of cultivation of farmers. So these companies are also there. Then, like I spoke about market linkages, input and output. So AgroStar is a company which is doing amazing work in input market linkage. NinjaCart is doing something in the output market linkage. So there are many successful case studies from India. And even if you look at from Southeast Asia and also, let's say, South Asia, there are other companies also who are doing amazing work. If I can think about it, Indonesia is a country which has got some really amazing innovations. Like there are companies who are using blockchain for lending to farmers. Then there are a lot of people who are using, again, IoT-based feeders, IoT-based irrigation systems. Vietnam has a company called Mimosa Tech. So what they are doing is they are doing irrigation through sensor-based models. So that is reducing the cost of, or the use of water by around 30 to 40%. It is reducing the dependence on labor. Like I already mentioned, drone technologies in China, they are doing amazing work out there. When I talk about circular economy and about the circularity part of things, India also has a lot of companies which are doing converting waste into power. But generally, in terms of everything circular, not only agriculture, if we have to look forward to someone and learn from them, it is the Netherlands. The Netherlands has done a lot in terms of circularity, and they have a lot of they have a lot of innovations that promotes circularity. So for instance, a lot of the initiatives that have been taken in India are being funded by agencies based out of the Netherlands, because they really have a lot of dedication towards circularity. For things like gender mainstreaming, agencies such as SEVA, which is a self-employed women's association, they are doing amazing work. IDH, the Sustainable Trade Initiative, is doing amazing work. So gender mainstreaming is happening. And a thing is that since I come from the impact ecosystem, what I realize is that now funders and even donors have an explicit focus on gender. So what is happening is that if I am going to fund your project, you will have to ensure to me that gender data is being collected. There's a continuous focus on monitoring how both genders are reacting to an intervention. So going forward, for development projects and for impact projects, I'm barring out corporates right now, but in terms of foundations, DFIs, development financial institutions who are putting in money, gender will automatically get mainstream. It will take a lot of time, but there has been a conscious effort everywhere to mainstream gender.
It's very insightful and interesting. And thanks, Shreejit, for making time and being with us here today. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you. So we should do this again sometime soon.
Thank you. I hope it was useful. And again, while there are a lot of other things also that can be done, front and back, I was going back to the same points because I think these are the most important from my personal experience. And this is an opinion. I'm sure other people might have other things to say, but I personally feel that these are the main issues which should be addressed. And solutions, like I will just summarize again the solutions, because I think that has to stick into it, and we have to work on it. So first is digitization. Digitization has to be will form a very critical part of the post-COVID time. Gender mainstreaming and circularity in agriculture. These are three things that I would like everyone to focus on and keep an eye open for interventions and things that we can learn from in these three spaces.
Amazing, amazing. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.